Hello, my name's Richard Harvey. I'm one of the professors here at Gresham College. I'm sponsored by the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists who wish to improve the understanding of IT. That's part of their mission anyway. And so I'm giving a series of lectures on the digital society. Cashless is one of those areas where I was fairly sure 12 months ago when I wrote the abstract for this lecture that I would want to talk a lot about the technology. And in fact, what happened as I prepared for this over the last year, I realised that there were very significant objections to the cashless society coming from some quite distinguished people. And I've just gathered some examples here before. And part of it needs picking apart. Part of the problem, I think, is that there's confusion in people's minds about what they're talking about, and part of it is people don't understand what technology can and can't do. So the purpose of this lecture really is to address these criticisms. I'm not going to talk about the technological details of electronic money, partly because I haven't got time, but also because there are some other lectures talking about Bitcoin and so on the channel. If we look at some of these people, I mean, Amartya Sen is a pretty distinguished economist. He got the Nobel Prize in economics. Did he really describe the cashless society as despotic? He's certainly written up as describing it on one of the cashless websites. Well, no, he didn't. He was actually talking about demonetization, which is a quite different thing. Demonetization was a scheme initiated by Mr. Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, and the idea was that certain high denomination notes in India were being used to fuel the black economy. So let's remove them overnight. We'll have people go back to the bank the following day, and if they've got a legitimate reason for having it, they can have new versions of the notes, and if they don't, well, tough, it will get confiscated. As it turned out, almost all the notes turned out to be legitimate. It was a bit of a flop, and there were huge queues around the block. A friend of mine was stuck in India at the time, and everybody started to use Uber to travel everywhere because nobody had any notes to give. Ken Rogoff is an economist at Harvard, and he's written about the need for cash for privacy. And then we've got these rather frantic headlines on the left, apparently discussing the cashless society and its problems. And you don't have to go far to find even more apocalyptic descriptions of the cashless society. Do not kid yourself, it will happen. Real mark of the beast stuff. I had to look it up, but that's apparently from Revelations 13. And the idea was that only those who had the mark would be able to buy and sell things. But being a little bit less hyperbolic, I would say in Sweden, most of the Nordic countries have gone quite a long way towards cashless. And if you've ever had the misfortune to try to get a taxi from, say, Reykjavik airport to Reykjavik city, you will know why that is, because you couldn't possibly pay that amount of money in notes. Sweden is the country that's often quoted as going a very long way down the cashless road. And the point about the protest movement in Sweden, Contant Upproret, which stands for, well, cash uproar, I suppose, or cash uprising. This is not a crazy protest movement. I mean, it's led by Bjorn Eriksson, who used to be the head of police in Sweden. And the point in Sweden is that the public have rushed headlong into cashless, driven by the banks and various other self-interested parties. And have we really planned for this, I think, is the spirit of the protest movement in Sweden. And that's really what this lecture is about. What are the legitimate parts of the protest? What are the illegitimate parts of protest to cashless? And what planning is required in order to be a successful cashless society? Or perhaps to put it in the counter, is it possible to be a successful cashless society? So that's what this lecture is going to be about. Rather unusual for me. I'm going to talk about matters of policy rather than technology. Well, I've scoured through the literature, and here are the principal objections to a cashless society, and some of them overlap. So with a bit of work, you can group them, which I've done here, and I have, just for ease of remembering, I've called them the 4 fears of cashless. So there are fears relating to privacy, those relating to usability, those relating to security, and then there are some simple financial objections to cashless. One of the things I noticed looking at this cashless debate is that a lot of people are heavily invested in one outcome or the other. So it is natural, isn't it, that MasterCard and Visa are spending a lot of money trying to persuade people that cashless is the way to go, because they have money invested in being cashless. And it's natural, isn't it, that European Central Bank, for example, might be rather against a rush to cashless because they haven't had a chance to plan for it. And a good example of that is a speech by one of their board members, why Europe still needs cash. And in that he outlines the pro-cashless people as either alchemists, as people who believe the zero lower bound can be exceeded or beaten, law and order merchants. I don't think he quite uses those words, but it's similar. People who are obsessed with the idea of cash being used by drug runners and terrorists and so on for illicit things. And if only cash wasn't there, then terrorism would go away, wouldn't it? And then there's the fintech crowd who are out to make a quick buck, I think, in his view. It's an interesting little speech. You, by all means, read it. You'll find the references in the accompanying transcript to this lecture. He's a bit fast and loose with these statistics, is this gent, I have to say. I mean, he asserts that the real reason not to go cashless is no one wants it. His statistic is that in 2016, he doesn't say 2016, but you can look at the source and find that's when it was, 79% of people used cash for transactions across Europe. Well, they did then, but that was before cashless for transport was introduced. It was relatively early in the process. And if you look at the corollary question, which is virtually on the same line of that report, which he doesn't mention in his speech, it says that I think around 30% of the people who are asked would wish to keep cash, but that by far the majority would wish cash was gone, regard it as a bit of a nuisance. And I'm afraid the experiment is being done in Sweden. In Sweden, people don't like it. And in this country, the United Kingdom, or virtually every country, people don't like cash. The issue isn't really for me whether we are going to have a cashless society or not, or whether we should have one or not. We're certainly going to have one. The issue is, how are we going to have one? Before I get into that, though, I thought I would just spend a few moments talking about what cash is, because a lot of the debaters seem to mischaracterize cash. You know, cash is sort of characterized as this Euclidean perfect ideal, and it is far from ideal. It has a number of quite substantial flaws associated with it. So one thing that is said very commonly is cash is free, and what people mean by that is it's free to use. Well, that's largely true. I mean, you don't usually pay to use cash in most countries. It certainly isn't free to produce, though. And okay, I mean, maybe I am not paying for it as the consumer, but if I pay value-added tax or income tax or any of the other numerous taxes, I jolly well am paying for it. I mean, if you take Japan, for example, which, to be fair, has notoriously expensive cash production, they spend $500 million a year producing cash, which that's around 30% of their central bank operational cost. Now, there are some more economical countries. I mean, it's possible to be a bit more economical with cash production in the European Union, for example, particularly if you're using the euro anyway, because essentially you can borrow your neighbour's production to help. And Slovenia is a good example of a cheap, it produces cash on the cheap, produces euros on the cheap, which is very canny. Actually, it's been studied what significant factors there are in the production of cash and its price. And it turns out that the number of security features isn't important at all. What else doesn't matter very much? I mean, the size of order that you make, so whether you've got a lot of cash in circulation or not, it doesn't seem to affect the cost of the notes. A whole load of factors they looked at. The one factor that does matter actually is the size of the note. So I've illustrated my slide with one of the larger notes out there, which is the 10,000 ringgit note from Brunei, great big jumbo thing, and a small little note from Poland. Poland is very canny when it comes to managing production costs. Even the distribution of cash costs money. You know, the Link network, which is the national network in the United Kingdom of cash machines, it's free to use, that produces notes on demand if you stick your card in. That costs £8 million a year to operate. So cash is free. No, it isn't free. It's cost money. Now, whether it costs any more money than one of the alternatives, that's actually quite a complex question. It's been pretty tricky for economists and scholars to really work out what the true cost of cash in circulation is at the moment. So there's a sort of nebulous number, but it certainly isn't free and it certainly isn't cheap. The next thing that's often said is cash is anonymous. Well, where'sgeorge.com is a fascinating website. If you've got some US currency in your pocket, type in the serial number of the notes and you can track where those notes turn up across the US. It's great fun. This screenshot is taken from a few days as lockdown was starting to be released from various states in the US, perhaps a little bit earlier than the rest of the world was expecting. And you can see on my map all these multiple dollar bills floating around the United States. The technology behind measuring the number on a dollar bill or a pound note or a euro note, the serial number as it's called, it is trivial. I mean, it's much easier to do that than the sort of shopping app that you can use in your local supermarket, which scans the QR code. You can control the lighting and the orientation. So I'd be very confident that you could build a till that automatically scans all the banknotes. It's very easy to connect the till to a bank. So tracking notes en masse is trivial. Now, so in principle, cash is not anonymous at all, unless we're talking about coins. So certainly banknotes are not anonymous. It is relatively easy to find out who is in a store, what they've spent, where they got their notes from, and so on and so on, if you wanted to. Now, custom and practice is that you don't, but the principle of anonymity, I think, really is broken. The next thing that's often said, I don't know what's really meant by this, but cash is safe or cash is secure. You can tell that to the wartime British government, who were faced with forging on an enormous scale from the German Nazi wartime government. Almost undermined the economy of the country had the notes gone into circulation. Very effective forging of British currency, and that problem is still out there. There are rumours that foreign powers are already trying to destabilise certain economies by the printing of superdollars or fake monies. So certainly, you know, it comes to mind as a possible destabilisation attempt, the printing of fake money. I was listening to a debate recently between sponsored by Monzo. Monzo is one of the new challenger banks in the United Kingdom. Have a very interesting app that you can download and use to manage your money. And in the course of a debate, one of the proponents of cashless said, of course, cash spreads disease. And the audience, clearly in this debate was in 2019, the audience just laughed. They thought this was such a risible idea that they just laughed. Well, no one's laughing now. This is a figure taken showing the viability of SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 in aerosols and on various surfaces. And although the figure's rather small, what you can probably see is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has a long lifetime on plastics, and a lot of banknotes are made of polymers now. So central banks have been a bit alarmed about this, and I've tracked some of their statements, which have been, well, typically bankerish. They've been sort of careful, in the extent that they've said handling banknotes is no more dangerous than handling anything else. Well, no more dangerous than handling anything else that might have been through multiple hands that day, no. And you should wash your hands afterwards, yes. But contactless, which is the alternative, is completely virus-free. So, no, I don't think cash can be regarded as safe or secure in the current environment, or in any environment for that matter. It involves contact. And perhaps a rather minor point, but I mean, if in times of hyperinflation you have the, although if hyperinflation wasn't annoying enough, you have the additional problem of having to print more money when you're working with cash. And this lady is in a German lady in the hyperinflation times, and there are numerous pictures of people wandering around with cash in wheelbarrows. But scroll forward to Venezuela if you would like another example of an economy that's got hyperinflation, or Zimbabwe. Okay, well, brief sort of point. What do we mean by cashless? I mean, people are often a bit sort of muddled about what cashless means. There's quite a nice table on this report that's produced. I think it's produced annually by G4S, the World Cash Report. G4S, of course, make money transporting cash around the world, so they're another group of people who would rather like the row on this table that marked cash to have lots of green arrows on it, and all of the other rows to have lots of crosses on it. So I'm afraid it's another example of a rather partial view of cash versus cashless. But I should say, one row on this table I am not going to consider are cheques. Right? Although cheques don't involve cash, they're almost dead in most countries and have just as many difficulties. So we're really interested in electronic instruments in this lecture, where the cash, the money is transferred electronically. Okay, so that was what the problem is, which is it's really a policy type discussion. And let's not forget that cash itself, which is often set up on this sort of Euclidean pillar of perfection, has problems. Now, let's return to the 4 fears of cashless. The first of those fears are financial fears, anxieties about financial aspects of the cashless society. And I suppose I should reveal that I'm possibly the worst person to talk about this. I'm not a professor of finance, but I feel for completeness and balance I ought to talk about them, at least mention some of them. So the first one is an obvious one and is well known, which is that credit cards certainly charge. They might not charge the user, the consumer, but they certainly charge the retailer. And some of these fees can be quite noticeable, and generally speaking, they're not very well liked by the retailer. And the profits of Visa and MasterCard are pretty substantial. So there's a very clear case of profiteering against those companies. Well, there are some solutions afoot, I would say. I mean, the obvious one, and I have to admit I've somewhat shoehorned this into the lecture, is to remember the good old Gresham adage, which is bad money drives out good. Now, what Gresham was really saying was that if one currency is cheaper to produce than another, but they have equal purchasing power, the cheaper one will dominate. Well, the same is true of credit cards and contactless and so on. I mean, if one bank offers a cheaper way of getting the same result, consumers, given it has the same security and privacy, then people will pretty much go for the cheaper one. So, and there's been some action, I think, across the banking sector on a feeling that banking and these electronic instruments need to be opened up somewhat, and that's led to a open banking initiative. And the idea behind open banking really is that the APIs, or the application programmer interfaces for these various things, should be more open. That would allow smaller players to come in, build innovation, and essentially drive some of these fees down. So that's one objection to the cost of the cashless society, which is going to be very expensive. I just simply can't see why, in principle, it has to be more expensive than the business of printing money. I mean, I agree that the costs need to work out, as it were, and I agree there will be fierce competition for cost if the market is set up right, but I don't really see why it should be any more. Why is it more expensive to move ones and zeros around the planet than it is to move bits of paper? I mean, it's most peculiar. That seems very odd. Another financial objection is a rather technical one, which I'm not very well qualified to comment on, but the idea is that in modern times anyway, there's a tendency for bankers to want to have negative interest rates. So in other words, if you put money in deposit at positive interest rate, the bank pays you for the privilege of depositing money. With a negative interest rate, you pay them. So the response to that is to keep cash under the bed, because your cash doesn't devalue in front of you, whereas the cash you put in the bank does. Right, well, depending on who you are, that's either a very bad idea or a very good idea. I mean, central bankers tend to think it's a bad idea because they have a knob called interest rates and they want to turn that knob and adjust the economy. And if they can't turn that knob and adjust the economy, and they can't turn that knob when people have got cash, they don't like it very much. Whereas if you're a consumer, you think it's rather nice being able to keep your cash under the bank and being immune from these wretched central bankers who want to charge you zero interest rates. So I can't really process that one, other than to say that if there was a concern, I think there's a concern within that concern that certain stratas of society should not be subject to negative interest rates, particularly impoverished people. Then, well, okay, we'll have thresholded interest rates or a non-linear interest rate. So if you've got less than this in your account, then you don't pay negative interest, you pay zero interest. Okay, I don't think that would be very serious. I don't think it would I think you'd still be able to operate monetary policy. These are all relatively easy technical solutions, I would say. There's nothing that says interest rate has to be proportionate. In fact, it jolly well isn't proportionate, as anyone who's run a treasury function on a big corporation will tell you. The interest rates they can get on long-term deposit with above a certain threshold are considerably better than they can in short-term deposit. So, all doable. In fact, much easier to do with cashless because it's quicker to change. Okay, so I don't think the financial fears amount to anything very sort of seriously blocking to cashless. What about privacy? There's a lot of concerns about privacy. The problem is that people's thinking on privacy, in my opinion, is a little bit sort of muddled. I mean, the first one I would say is that cash, as we've already discussed, is in practice far from anonymous. I mean, it can be anonymous, and we think it's anonymous, but it need not be anonymous. Perhaps I should have said in principle is far from anonymous. And anyway, what are we talking about here when people talk about privacy? Are we talking about anonymity or privacy? Because they're not the same thing at all. Privacy is the right to go about your daily business without people knowing what you're doing. So as long as you're going about your business in a lawful way, why should anyone know what you're doing? Well, the best way to protect that is legislation. Right? And the USA, with the, what's it called, the CCA, the California Consumer Act, I think. Oh God, I'll have to check this. And GDPR in the US. Give consumers certain rights. So they'll say, if an organisation is holding information about you, then you have a right to not have that information passed on. You have a right to not transact with that organisation if you think it's holding too much information with you. You have a right to... well, actually, I'll come back to the right to not transact. You have a right to ask what they're doing with it, and so on and so on. Now, the implicit behind those assumptions is the idea that you could always go to somewhere else. So if you're going to design the system that has privacy in it, you also have to have some choice. I don't have to bank with Lloyds if I don't like what they're doing to my money. I could bank with First Direct or some other bank, HSBC, which owns First Direct. Okay, those would be, provided that the customer has choice, then you develop a sort of market in privacy, and that allows people to make the right choices. And then you just have to protect that the information and the way it's used. So that's how privacy can work. You have to have a very firm view about what privacy is. Anonymity is almost impossible to achieve. At this point, somebody will usually point out that distributed ledger systems, so Bitcoin and Ethereum and so on, are highly anonymous, aren't they? Not really. What these distributed ledger systems do is they keep a complete record of all transactions. So they'll tell you when a coin was minted, who owned it, and who exchanged it, and when, I think. So that complete record is obtained. The interesting thing is a unique and secret key identifies the ownership of the coin. So it's perfectly true that you cannot look at one of the Bitcoin registries, and they're all public, and work out who owns something. So in that sense, it's completely anonymous. However, you do have to buy Bitcoin with real currency, and you do have to convert it into something. So as soon as you transact with it, as soon as you go and buy your, wonderful high-definition TV system, somebody keeps a record of who you are. And at that point, you've linked the ID with a real ID, and you can backtrack and work out all of the transactions that happened with Bitcoin. So it's got this sort of cascade effect. It's pretty anonymous until it isn't, and then it jolly well isn't. Furthermore, there's some very interesting work done recently on clustering similar transactions, which shows that you can quite effectively de-anonymize certainly Bitcoin just by running some cluster analysis, and there's a reference to that in the transcript actually. So total anonymity is not at all realistic either for cash or cashless. Privacy is best guaranteed through legislation. One of the advantages, I think, of cashless is that IT systems store their information in a schema, and the schema describes what the information is, how it's put together, and what it isn't, if you like. So you're much clearer with a design system that you find in cashless computer systems. You're much clearer what the information is. In the cash system, it's a bit of a miasma about what people know and what they don't know. I mean, I've just described this. I mean, people know that there's a unique code on a banknote, but it's not at all clear the extent to which those codes are tracked, who does the tracking, and what use it's put to. And that's because there isn't really a schema, and there isn't any agreement between the entities transferring cash as to what tracking they should do. Electronic systems aren't like that. You have to have a design at the outset. Okay, so I therefore sort of put a line through privacy and financial, because it doesn't seem to me they're killer reasons for not going cashless. There are some issues. There needs to be good design to make sure that they can be handled. I would say the privacy issue is pretty much covered in the European Union by existing legislation, but I'd be happy to debate that vigorously if someone thinks otherwise. So let's turn to the ones that are perhaps a bit more serious. Usability and security. Now, usability is usually brought up to the fore by the cash lobby, and there's several groups of people who are often talked about with cashless being a problem. And here they are, really. There's the people without bank accounts, the bankless, we call them, people who don't have computers, they're computerless, and I rather rudely call them a spendthrift. I mean, I include myself in that category. People who find difficulty budgeting. I mean, I think the honest truth is that we all find difficulty budgeting. You know, budgeting is tricky. So let's talk about the bankless. Well, in the UK, a few years ago, the British government introduced legislation to make the 9 principal banks offer what was called a basic bank account. And a basic bank account doesn't allow any borrowing, it doesn't have an overdraft. And I think the last time I checked, about 7 million people had taken out these bankless bank accounts. Nevertheless, there are respectable commentators. Martin Lewis, who is a consumer commentator here, he runs something called the moneysavingexpert.com website, said that they're not very well promoted by banks. That's pretty true, and they don't really work, which is why I've written they're hopeless. And at least in this country and in most countries yet, the government doesn't have a state bank account. It's perfectly possible to have a state bank account. I mean, after all, the Bank of England does hold bank accounts for the large clearing banks. I mean, the reason they don't hold it for you and me is because it's a bit of a fiddle-faddle. But you could easily have a system where, you know, the ultimate repository of citizens' money, if they wished, was the state bank account, and that might indeed be a solution. In fact, there are consultations about a lot of the central banks now have consultations out at the moment on doing precisely this. So it is true that you cannot have a cashless society without having a bank account. So you cannot allow citizens to not have bank accounts. It is also true that if you're going to rely on a bank account, you have to rely on the state being benign. You know, I mean, there's an assumption that your bank account will not get seized or closed or otherwise mucked about with by the state. Because if it does, you can't transact anything in a cashless society and you're stuck. So you'd have to be very careful to make sure that the bank account isn't just a nice to have, it's a need to have. It's become a human right to have a bank account in the cashless society. So that possibly needs thinking about. You know, what would happen? Can you introduce the strongest legal protection to make sure that people cannot have their bank account closed, even in very extreme circumstances? So you can see that's challenging for governments. You know, at least in the UK, the Customs and Excise already has draconian powers to close, seize assets without really proper evidence. You know, it can do this. It just has to have suspicion. So there needs to be some care on this. But I think it's a positive in the sense that it's a flipping nuisance that some people don't have bank accounts, to be perfectly honest. I don't think it helps them, and I don't think it helps society that we have people without bank accounts. Numbers seem to differ as to how many people in the UK don't have bank accounts. I would presume it's getting below 1 million out of a population of about 70 million now. But obviously you cannot go cashless without a bank account, and it needs to be a relatively inexpensive, if not free, option to have one, as it is, I think, with a basic bank account. So that's one group of people. Now, what I'm getting to here is the idea of designing a system. If you're going to go cashless, you have to have a system for going cashless, and it has to be thought about, and it has to be designed. Now, the same is true, really, of people who can't use or won't use or don't use computers. I mean, cashless can work without computers, at least on a simple transactional level. I mean, I don't need a computer to use my contactless credit card, but I do need a computer really to pay the bills, and I do need a mobile phone to manage my bank account nowadays. Lots of things you could do. I mean, mobile phones are pretty affordable now, so the state could give you a mobile phone. I mean, why not? Gives you other things. Gives you bins to collect your waste in. Why not give you a mobile phone? You could have IT centres where citizens can go and use secure terminals to transact. I mean, that's been the solution Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan gets quite a good e-government rating. Kazakhstan probably wouldn't work here. I mean, they have a public key infrastructure system, so everybody has a unique ID and a card that identifies them. Britain is very averse to this. You could go for a sort of more French system. French have these interesting buildings called médiathèques, which are they're sort of combinations of art galleries, libraries, and a bit of information access. Sort of modern library. I'm very attracted to them because they're nice spaces to hang out. But that might also get you somewhere. What I would say, that, however, is I wouldn't want us to go down to a Sweden. Sweden has sort of hurled itself towards cashless without even realising, I think, that it was going cashless. Nobody likes cash. Retailers don't like it. Consumers don't like it. Nobody's very keen on it. And before they knew it, suddenly they were almost cashless. I think a much better model is the United Kingdom when it decimalised. So the United Kingdom used to have a very peculiar coin system which was difficult to understand, so they had a big effort to decimalize things. I think it was 1971 when this happened. There was a big publicity effort to explain to people this is what the new money looks like, this is when it will be coming in, and I think the banks closed for 5 days. Well, so there was a point when the banks were dealing in the old money, and then they closed for 5 days, sort themselves out, and they opened again. Big disruption, and a lot. Well, I found a fascinating little example. This is the decimalisation song, no less, where Max Bygraves, of all people, tries to remind us that a change is
decimalisation. We call it decimalisation. Decimalisation.
There we go, decimalisation. Well, maybe obviously to have a cashless song by I don't know, Robbie Williams or someone. So in those days, governments planned for change, and they had big public information campaigns to make the change, and they had a lot of deliberation before making the change. They didn't just slide into things. So the last category of usability concerns is about budgeting. Now, why should cash be easier to budget with than an app? I cannot find a reason for this. I mean, it seems most mysterious to me. I mean, there might be some deep psychological reason why piles of money are easier to deal with than pots of money. I mean, one of the better systems I know is Monzo. Monzo allows you to allocate your money into what it calls pots, and you might have a pot for paying the mortgage, you might have one for drinking out and one for the car and so on. And as you make transactions, you can label them, so you see how the money is stacking up against the pots. It's a electronic analogue of a very well-known domestic budgeting system, separate budgets for separate items. It works pretty well. I can't really see why going virtual would make things worse. If anything, it makes things a lot better because you can run agents on the side of an app that really can help you make decisions. I mean, they can point out that you're spending a lot of money on this, and wouldn't it be better if you rebid your heating bills because it seems very expensive given the size of your house and all those sort of things. You can integrate properly. Now, in order to integrate properly with your bank account, you do have to deal with an issue, which is if you're banking with one of the major banks in one of the major countries around the world, a lot of those banks will be making their money from you by making you borrow money. Well, not making you borrow money, encouraging you to borrow money. They say they don't, but they do. And the more you can borrow, and the more extreme the forms of borrowing, so unauthorised borrowing fees, make them a lot of money. So obviously the app, which is controlled by the bank, hardly makes it evident to you how to budget. It's not in their interests for you to budget properly because then you're not borrowing anything. So how to get around this problem? Well, probably open banking is the answer. I mean, your banking app need not be provided by the bank. they're holding the money. But why shouldn't you use any number of apps to access and transact with your bank? Why should they provide the only way of transacting with your app? So cashless, in my view, does get a lot better if you can implement open banking. Otherwise, I'm painting the banks in a bad picture here. And of course, they're not bad. They've got plenty of good-natured people and lots of public-spirited individuals in them. But it's more a sort of conflict of interest matter. If you have a business model that makes you a lot of money doing that thing, but that thing doesn't happen to be very good for society, you've got a sort of tragedy of the commons, really, whereas if everyone does it, it's a big problem. Okay, so the usability issues, they are not trivial, but they are addressable, in my view, but we need to get a move on. Just stumbling into cashless without actually addressing these issues is pretty dangerous. So security is the last one on the list. In my view, this is the most serious of the issues, and it's the one that deserves the most serious attention. And first thing I would say is I'm not really sure that cashless is very secure. People are very fond of telling you how insecure cash is, and you can get one of the members of ABBA, who was a very enthusiastic supporter of cashless, became a supporter because I think his son was mugged while carrying a large amount of cash. And obviously, it's very sad if you suffer physical violence. Given the choice of two unpleasant alternatives, it's better to be defrauded than punched in the mouth, I would have thought. But I'm not really sure the evidence is there that cash is that insecure. Digital fraud, it isn't rising in the UK. It's falling, but I wouldn't describe it as insubstantial. There's no question that there are quite noticeable fraud cases. So here are the four main causes of digital fraud identified by UK Finance. Very nice characterisation of fraud, and the two big ones are payment card issues. So people pretending to be other people, getting spurious cards, getting things delivered to addresses that don't belong to thing, that sort of thing. And the new one, authorised push payments. Authorised push payments is a fascinating new fraud because they're very large sums of money. So it works like this: you're buying a house, you're about to complete on your transaction, and your solicitor sends you an email. A lawyer, if you prefer, solicitor is the UK name for a lawyer, sends an email saying, would you please put the remaining balance into my escrow account? So you deposit hundreds of thousands of pounds, according to their email, into the account. The following day, the solicitor rings you up and said, where's the money? And you say, I sent it to you, and you didn't. What, you actually sent it to a fraudster's account, and by now the money has been distributed across the whole of European Union or wherever, and it's lost. And because you authorised it as a consumer, there is no recourse. Your mistake, not mine, says everyone very rapidly, and you're left high and dry. So I mentioned this fraud because it's an interesting one. It's an example where cashless isn't of itself responsible for the fraud, is it? There was nothing fraudulent. The consumer decided to make that transaction. They made the wrong decision, but they made the transaction. What was wrong was the solicitor communicating with you in such an insecure way that anyone could read it. That was highly irresponsible and astonishing. So cashless brings with it some obligations on the rest of the infrastructure. So, for example, your bank really should not be emailing you. It should be using its own messaging service, or it should be using end-to-end encrypted messaging to deal with you, and so should your solicitor and financial agents. Email is not the right mechanism for communication of secure items, not at least raw email. So there's a little observation, which is if you're going to go to cashless, you need to also design a little bit of the infrastructure to support cashless. The other problem, I think, is frankly this one, which is whilst fraud is, these are quite large numbers, the fraud to turnover ratio is minuscule. It's 0.08%. So what might be a very upsetting fraud to us as consumers is frankly of negligible consequence to the finance industry, and that really needs to change. I mean, you really do have to pursue with cashless system with considerable aggression fraud, and the finance industry has got a lot better at catching some of these frauds, and it made our life more annoying in the process. It is annoying being rung up at 2 a.m. asking, "Are you in Florida making a purchase of, a woman's dress?" When you're actually in Norwich asleep. But this is part of fraud detection. Funnily enough, good record keeping and artificial intelligence has a good role to play in that detection. So I think of the concerns of the fears I've talked about, this is the most serious one. I've said hideously insecure compared to cash. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration. I mean, there are security issues. I would say so far, we haven't seen any major wide-scale digital fraud on the banks, at least I'm aware of. I mean, not unnaturally, banks seem to keep quiet about such things. A couple of things that I would observe is that obviously in the cashless society, it would be rather foolish to rely on one bank. Why would you do that? You need to have two banks, and they need to be redundant, meaning you don't want to be using a bank that is actually relying on some other bank's infrastructure. I'm afraid that's very common in this country. For example, if you're completing a payment on PayPal, you might think you're using PayPal, but you're actually using JP Morgan's infrastructure. Nothing wrong with that. JP Morgan's a very respectable company. But if you're also banking with JP Morgan, don't you have a right to know that these two sets of money that you thought were being handled independently are actually being handled highly dependently? Hidden dependencies are something that's already caught out the finance industry several times before, so I don't think it's a good idea to let that happen accidentally. I also think you've got to have redundant IT, and I don't mean redundant IT in banks. I mean, that's highly redundant. What I mean is, if a bank's infrastructure fails due to being hacked or some other issue, you don't want the whole finance system falling over. So now stress testing, which central banks are rather keen on, helps test some of that. It is a little bit odd. I mean, in the transcript, I analogize that to allowing people to build a railway bridge using whatever materials they like, and then driving a locomotive over the top of it and seeing whether it fails. That's stress testing. What we want is design, and design says these are the critical areas, this is where we need redundancy, this is why it's unlikely to fail. Part of that design is ongoing at the moment, and a lot of banks are consulting on giving freer access to a wider range of organisations to depositing in the central bank. That will probably help. I think you could also introduce more work on deltas, so rates of change. If you see too much flow, you could just slow it down. There's very few systems where you need to move large amounts of money from one account to another account on the day. You need to know that the money will be coming, but if you say, "I'm sorry, you can only move £1 million a day, so it will take you 10 days to flow that transaction," as long as you know the money's there and you have a secure way of moving it, then why don't we just flow it slowly? Now, the advantage of flowing it slowly is a lot of fraud thrives on high speed. And this last point feeds into, this flow restriction, something that a lot of people are interested in, but it's not really very well worked out yet, I think, which is programmable money. I think programmable money has a lot of potential here. So I've talked about one example of programmable money is money that flows slowly. It's sticky money. So you agree to pay me £1,000. Thank you very much. But programmable money only flows to me £100 a day. One of my bank accounts has this sort of feature on it. You can only transact a certain amount per day, and after that you have to move it to the next day. It's quite a good system. So programmable money can go a lot further than this. So here's an example using Bob and Alice. Bob and Alice are the famous characters in computer security. All computer security papers have two people trying to communicate who are always called Bob and Alice, and then there's usually an interloper, often called Eve, because she's eavesdropping. Anyway, so Bob's trying to buy a car from Alice. So the way this situation starts off is that Bob has the money, Alice has the car. Now, typically, this car, Bob might agree to buy the car from Alice, but it might be subject to some conditions. Maybe a survey has to happen. So an authorised mechanic, who they both agree on, will tick the condition. In this case, it satisfies the UK Ministry of Transport test. So as long as it passes that test, it's fine and the goods can change hands. Now, the way you handle that sort of transaction with programmable money is Bob firstly produces a pot of money to pay for the car, and then this is the clever bit, if you like, he then binds a program to that pot of money, and the program can be interrogated by Alice. So Alice asks, does Bob have the money? And the program says, yes, there's an amount of money to pay for this car. Fantastic. At this point, Bob's got the programmable pot and Alice has got the car. So the next thing that's going to happen, the money gets ready to move, as it were, but the money is only going to move when the third party authorises the transaction, at which point the interchange happens, and now Bob has got the car and Alice has the money, and once Alice has got the money, the program determines that the car has moved over there, and the program then destroys itself, and then Alice has the money and she's free to go. So an essential part of this is being able to bind programs or conditions to cash. Well, that's technically possible. I mean, those sorts of encryptions that we're using in distributed ledger systems are really a sort of an attractive prospect for this. You could bind cash with a program. And if you think this through, you've got all sorts of fascinating things. You can, with programmable money, you say, well, this is the amount of money this month for spending on the mortgage. You could say, if Alice was a car dealer, you could say, well, this money, I'm not quite sure what car I'm going to buy, but this money can only be spent on standard industry codes that are associated with car dealers. So if a fraudster comes along and they're working from an entity that isn't coded, the money says, oh, I'm not going over there. Or you can have the money, but you won't be able to access it. Cashless allows you to do this. If you've got open standards that allow these programs to interact with banking systems, the cost of fraud becomes quite considerably higher. And that's always what we're looking for in a computer security system, really. Not that fraud's impossible. Fraud is never impossible. But there's an order of complexity which equals money and cost being forced on the fraudster. And programmable money is one idea, which I quite like, as you can tell, because I'm enthusiastic about it, that might help you achieve that. And of course that would mean that the bank manager, well, bank managers are never very popular people, are they? And I think that's because they're trying to sort of help yourselves. I mean, there's this wonderful joke that I like, a rather sort of gruesome joke about, where a man rings up and says, I'd like to speak to Mr. Smith, the bank manager, please. And the receptionist says, I'm afraid Mr. Smith passed away yesterday. And he says, oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that. The following day he rings up and the same person rings up and says, I'd like to speak to Mr. Smith. And he says, oh, I'm sorry, he passed away. And this goes on for a couple of days, and eventually the receptionist said, look, why do you keep asking about Mr. Smith? I've told you he's died. Why do you keep asking us? And the man the other end says, I like to hear it. So bank managers aren't always that popular because they're trying to make these decisions that sort of save you from yourself. Well, maybe in the future your bank manager would be a program. it would be an algorithm that controlled these little algorithms that themselves are controlling your money. Now, whether you think of that as a dystopian view or a highly desirable view, I would suggest tells you something about which side of the debate you're going to fall onto cashless. What I would say is that cashless is going to happen whether we like it or not. The question is, are we going to design for it, or are we just going to let it happen? Now, that feature of design has been very important in these lectures. Successful innovations in digital society seem to be associated with forethought, design and planning, and the less successful ones are associated with evolution and adaptation. And that's probably the situation we're in with digital healthcare. Digital healthcare has got a lot of exciting technology associated with it, but across the globe there's some real issues about interoperability of systems and design, and this is probably quite a good time to talk about those, so that's what I want to do in the next lecture. Thank you.